No one remembers the moment you choose to be kind, until it costs you everything. The fluorescent lights above the pharmacy flickered like they couldn't decide whether to stay or give up, and I remember thinking that felt about right for my life too. I was standing in line with a bottle of generic painkillers and a pack of instant noodles, mentally calculating whether I had enough left in my account to make it to Friday when I heard the sound behind me. Small, sharp, wrong. A child's breath catching like something was breaking inside him. I turned before I could stop myself, and saw him, maybe 6 or 7 years old, pale, shaking, his mother kneeling beside him with panic written across her face like a language everyone understood, but no one wanted to speak. "He needs the prescription," she said to the pharmacist, her voice thin, stretched. "Please, I'll pay next week." And the man behind the counter didn't even look up at first, just tapped something into the register and said, flat, rehearsed, "I'm sorry, ma'am. We can't release medication without payment." Like, he'd said it 100 times before and none of those times had changed anything. The boy's hand twitched, and something in my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. I didn't think. I never do in moments like that. I just stepped forward, heard my own voice before I recognized it. "I'll cover it." And suddenly the room shifted, like everyone noticed me at once, like I'd stepped into a spotlight I didn't ask for. The pharmacist hesitated, finally looking up, eyes scanning me, my worn jacket, my tired face, probably calculating risk, and I slid my card across the counter before he could say no. I knew what was on it. Almost nothing, but I also knew what it meant not to get help when you needed it. The machine beeped, too loud in the quiet, and for a second I thought it would decline, that this would all collapse into embarrassment and regret, but then it approved, a soft, final sound, and the tension in the mother's shoulders broke like glass. "Thank you," she whispered, over and over, like the words might disappear if she didn't hold onto them tightly enough. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because if I did I might say something stupid like it's nothing when it wasn't nothing. It was rent money, groceries, the fragile balance of a life already stretched too thin. I picked up my own items next, sliding them forward, but when the total came up, I already knew. I didn't have enough left. "You're short," the pharmacist said, not unkind, just factual, and I felt heat rise to my face. That familiar mix of pride and quiet humiliation. I forced a small smile. "It's okay. I don't need them." And I meant it, or at least I told myself I did. I turned, ready to leave, ready to pretend this was a good decision I wouldn't pay for later, when I felt it. That shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had changed. Someone was watching me. I didn't turn right away, but I saw him in the reflection of the glass door, a man standing just behind where I'd been, still, composed, out of place in a way I couldn't explain. Dark coat, clean lines, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but took it anyway. Our eyes met in the reflection for half a second, and something cold and precise flickered there. Not judgment, not curiosity, something else. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting my face, grounding me, reminding me that whatever that was, whoever he was, it didn't matter. I had made my choice. I had paid the price. And I walked away without knowing that someone behind me had just decided I shouldn't have to. I made it halfway down the block before I realized my hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from hunger, but from that strange, lingering feeling of being watched, like something unseen had followed me out of the pharmacy and was still standing just behind my shoulder. The street was quiet for a Tuesday night. A couple of cars passing, headlights sliding across the pavement in slow, indifferent streaks. And I told myself to stop being dramatic, that not every moment had to mean something. That sometimes you just help someone and go home and nothing changes. But something had already changed. I could feel it in the way my chest refused to settle, in the way every small sound seemed louder than it should have been. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening my banking app even though I already knew what it would say, the number sitting there like a quiet accusation, barely enough to cover anything. Definitely not enough to fix what I had just broken in my own life. I exhaled slowly, pressing my lips together, doing the math again like it might magically come out different this time. Like maybe I had missed something, forgotten a deposit, imagined an extra $20. Somewhere. I had not. Great. I whispered to no one, the word tasting flat, and for a second I considered going back inside, asking for the items I left behind, explaining something, anything, but I did not move. Pride is a strange thing. It keeps you standing even when sitting down would make more sense. I started walking again, pulling my jacket tighter around me, counting steps instead of dollars because it hurt less that way. When the sound of an engine rolled slowly up behind me, not loud, not aggressive, just there, matching my pace in a way that made my skin tighten instinctively. I told myself not to turn, but I did anyway. A black car, clean, expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself, idled beside the curb, the kind of car you notice even when you pretend you do not. The window did not roll down, no one called out, and for a moment I thought I had imagined the connection, that this was just coincidence layered on top of an already long day. Then the rear door opened. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet, deliberate motion, like it had always been meant to happen. I stopped walking. I do not know why. Maybe because something in me recognized that this was not random, that this was the same shift I had felt inside the pharmacy now unfolding in real time. He stepped out like he had all the time in the world, like the street, the night, the silence all belonged to him in a way I could not explain. Up close, he looked exactly like he had in the reflection, controlled, precise, the kind of presence that made everything around him feel slightly out of alignment. For a second neither of us spoke, and I hated that I was the first to break it. Are you following me? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, and his expression did not change, not surprise, not amusement, just a calm assessment, like he was measuring something invisible. You should have walked away, he said, his voice low, even, the kind that did not need to be raised to be heard. I blinked, caught off guard, a small, sharp laugh escaping before I could stop it. From what exactly? And that was when his eyes shifted slightly, not softer, not warmer, but different, like I had said something he had not expected. From problems that are not yours, he replied, and something in that sentence settled heavily between us, like it carried more weight than it should have. I crossed my arms, more for myself than for him. Grounding, steadying, someone needed help, I said, because it was the only explanation that made sense to me, the only one I had ever needed. He studied me for a moment longer, and I had the strange, unsettling feeling that he was not just hearing my words, he was deciding what they meant, what I meant, like I was a variable in an equation he had already solved. Then he reached into his coat, and for half a second my breath caught, not from fear exactly, just from the unknown, but when his hand came back out, it was empty, open, nothing threatening, nothing dramatic. You paid for something tonight, he said, and I frowned slightly. Yes, I did, and I cannot afford to do it again. So if this is about, it is not, he cut in, not harsh, just final. And then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, he added, you owe me nothing. And the words should have ended the conversation, should have closed whatever this was. But they did not. They lingered, heavy, unfinished, like there was something underneath them he had not said yet. I stared at him, trying to understand why those words felt less like freedom and more like the beginning of something I could not see yet, something that had already decided I was part of it. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, trying to understand why someone like him would step into a moment like mine and then walk away as if it meant nothing, and the more I looked at him, the more I realized it was not nothing to him either. It was controlled, deliberate, like every word he chose had already been weighed before it left his mouth. I did not ask you for anything, I said finally, because it mattered, because I needed it to be clear, and his gaze did not waver, not even slightly. I know, he replied, and there was something in that answer that made it worse, not better, like he had already accounted for that too. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, trying to break whatever strange tension had settled between us. Then we are done here, I added, turning slightly as if to leave, because that was the normal thing to do. That was how conversations ended when they did not make sense. But I did not take a step, not yet, because something in me hesitated, something that did not trust how easily this could be over. Emily Carter, he said, and the sound of my name in his voice stopped me cold, sharper than anything else he could have done. I turned back, my heart kicking once hard. How do you know that? I asked, and for the first time there was a pause, small, almost invisible, but it was there. I make it my business to know things that matter, he said. And the way he said matter made it clear he was not talking about random details. He was talking about decisions, consequences, people. I felt a flicker of something I did not like, not fear exactly, but awareness. Like I had just stepped onto a surface that looked solid but might not be. I am not something that matters, I said, more firmly than I felt, and his eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary, like he was deciding whether to correct me. You were tonight, he replied, and there it was again, that quiet weight behind simple words. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay grounded. You still did not answer my question, I said, because if I let him control the conversation, I would lose whatever balance I had left. A faint shift touched his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name. The pharmacy has cameras, he said, and it was such a simple explanation that it almost annoyed me, because it sounded ordinary, but nothing about this felt ordinary. That is invasive, I said, crossing my arms again, and this time there was no mistaking it, a slight narrowing of his eyes, not anger, not offense, just recognition that I was not backing down. That is how the world works, he answered, and I shook my head immediately. No, that is how your world works, I corrected, and for a second the silence between us deepened, heavier, like something had shifted just beneath the surface. A car passed at the end of the street, headlights briefly illuminating his face, and I saw it clearer then. Not just control, not just power, but something restrained, something that did not show itself easily. You think helping someone is simple, he said, quieter now, almost thoughtful, and I frowned slightly. It is, I answered, because to me it always had been, even when it hurt. His gaze moved past me for a fraction of a second, scanning the street like he was checking something I could not see, then returned, sharper, more focused. It is not simple when it puts you in someone else's story, he said, and something in my chest tightened again, that same instinct from earlier rising back up. I am not part of your story, I said quickly, because I needed that to be true, because the alternative felt too complicated, too dangerous in a way I could not define. He held my gaze, unblinking, and for the first time there was no immediate response, just silence stretching long enough that I almost filled it myself. Then he nodded once. Slow, deliberate, like he had made a decision I was not part of. Not yet, he said, and before I could ask what that meant, before I could decide whether to stay or leave, he turned, moving back toward the car with the same controlled ease he had stepped out with, the door opening before he reached it like someone else had already anticipated his movement. He paused with one hand on the frame, glancing back just long enough for our eyes to meet one last time, and there was something final in that look, something that felt like a line had been drawn even if I could not see where. Then he got in, the door closing softly, the car pulling away without a sound, leaving me standing there with the echo of his words settling into something I could not shake, because for the first time that night, I realized this was not over, it had just begun. I stayed there longer than I should have, staring at the empty stretch of road where the car had disappeared, like if I looked hard enough I might understand what had just happened, but the night gave me nothing back, just the low hum of distant traffic and the cold air settling deeper into my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of instinct than warmth, and finally forced my feet to move again, one step, then another, grounding myself in something simple, something normal, because whatever that was, whoever he was, it did not belong in my life. That is what I told myself as I walked the remaining 3 blocks to my apartment, counting each crack in the sidewalk, each flickering streetlight, each passing shadow. Like if I focused hard enough on the details, I could push him out of my mind. By the time I reached my building, my hands had stopped shaking, but the feeling had not left. That quiet awareness that something unseen had shifted. The front door stuck like it always did, and I had to shoulder it open. The familiar smell of old carpet and someone else's dinner greeting me like a routine I could rely on. This place was not much, 2 flights of narrow stairs, peeling paint, a hallway light that buzzed louder than it shined. But it was mine, or at least it was until the end of the month if I could not figure something out. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs heavier now, exhaustion catching up to everything I had been holding off. And when I reached my door, I paused, keys in hand, because something was off. The hallway was quieter than usual, not empty, just still, like even the building itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was tired, that my brain was trying to make patterns out of nothing, and I unlocked the door anyway, stepping inside and closing it quickly behind me. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it, small, cluttered in a way that made sense only to me, a thin couch pushed against the wall, a chipped coffee table with unpaid bills, stacked neatly in one corner, a single lamp casting a warm but weak circle of light. I dropped my keys into the dish by the door and leaned back against it for a second, closing my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me. This was real. This was safe. This was something I understood. I pushed myself forward, moving toward the kitchen area, grabbing a glass of water, because it was something to do, something normal. But halfway through filling it, I noticed the envelope. It was sitting on the counter, right in the center, where I could not miss it, clean, white, out of place in a room that had never known that kind of precision. My stomach tightened instantly, because I knew, without opening it, without touching it, that it had not been there before. I set the glass down slowly, the sound of it against the counter louder than it should have been, and stared at the envelope like it might explain itself if I gave it enough time. There was no name on the front, no address, nothing to make it ordinary, just my space, my apartment, something inside it that did not belong. I stepped closer, each movement careful, controlled, like that would somehow change what I was about to find, and picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, not much, just enough to make my pulse pick up again. For a second I considered not opening it, leaving it there, pretending I had never seen it. But that had never been who I was. Not tonight, not ever. I slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Slowly, pulling out a single sheet of paper, the edges crisp, the kind that had never been folded twice. There were only a few words on it, typed, clean, deliberate, the same kind of control I had seen in him. For what you spent, it read, and beneath it, nothing else, no name, no explanation, just a number written in bold that made my breath catch. Far more than I had paid, more than I could have justified, more than I could accept. I stared at it, the room suddenly feeling smaller, tighter, like the walls had shifted inward without asking permission. This was not help. This was not kindness. This was something else, something that came with weight, with intention, with a meaning. I did not fully understand yet. I lowered the paper slowly, my fingers tightening around it. And for the first time since I left the pharmacy, I understood what he meant, not in words, but in presence, in action. I owed him nothing, he had said, and standing there in my kitchen, holding something that should not have been there, I realized that was the part that scared me the most, because it meant this was not about debt. It was about choice, his choice, and somehow, without asking, he had just made me part of it. I did not sit down. I did not take off my jacket. I just stood there in the middle of my apartment with that paper in my hand, reading the number again like it might change if I blinked enough times, like it might shrink into something reasonable, something I could accept without feeling like I had just stepped into a situation I did not control. But it stayed the same, precise, intentional, impossible to ignore. No, I whispered under my breath, the word coming out sharper than I expected. Because this was not help. This was intrusion. This was someone crossing a line I had never agreed to draw. I folded the paper once, then again, not carefully, just enough to contain it, and set it back on the counter like distance might make it less real, but it did not. It only made the silence louder. I paced once across the room, then back again, my thoughts moving faster than my steps, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into anything normal. He said I owed him nothing. But people like him did not do things without reason, without return, without expectation, even if they did not say it out loud. I knew that much, even if I did not understand the details. I stopped near the door, glancing at the lock, at the frame, at the space where this envelope had somehow appeared without a sound, without permission, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had access, not just to information, but to my space, my life, the small boundaries I had spent years building just to feel like I had something of my own. That thought settled heavily, not panic, not fear, just a steady awareness that I was no longer invisible in the way I had always counted on. I turned back toward the counter, staring at the envelope again, and this time I forced myself to look at it differently, Not as a gift, not as a favor, but as a message. This is what I can do. It seemed to say, this is how easily I can reach you. This is how close I already am. My jaw tightened slightly, because if that was true, then ignoring it was not an option. I walked back over, picked it up again, and slid the paper out, studying the number one more time, committing it to memory like it meant something beyond its value. Then I moved to the small drawer by the sink, pulling out an old receipt, a pen that barely worked, and I wrote the same number down, slower this time, deliberate, controlled, like I was taking ownership of it instead of letting it sit there like something given to me. I did not know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing clearly. I was not going to keep it. Not like this, not without understanding what it came with. I folded my copy and slipped it into my jacket pocket, then took the original and placed it back into the envelope, sealing it this time, pressing the edge down firmly as if that could somehow close whatever door had been opened. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the red digits blinking quietly, telling me it was later than I thought, that the night was already moving forward whether I was ready or not. For a second, I considered waiting until morning, convincing myself that this could sit, that I could deal with it later, but that same instinct that had made me step forward in the pharmacy rose up again, steady, insistent. I did not wait then, and I was not going to wait now. I grabbed my keys, the metal cool against my palm, and headed back toward the door, pausing only long enough to take one last look at the small, familiar space behind me. The couch, the lamp, the stack of bills that still had not solved themselves. This was my life. Simple, difficult, mine, and whatever he thought he was doing, whatever world he came from, it did not get to rewrite that without me choosing it. I opened the door, stepped back into the dim hallway, and closed it behind me with quiet certainty, because for the first time since this started, I was not just reacting, I was deciding. If he wanted me to be part of something, then he was going to have to hear me say no to his face. I moved down the hallway faster than I meant to, my footsteps echoing off the narrow walls like they were louder than they should have been, like the building itself was paying attention now, and I hated that feeling. Hated that something as simple as walking out of my own apartment suddenly felt like stepping into someone else's plan. The stairwell light flickered as I pushed through the door, the metal handle cold under my hand, and I took the steps two at a time, not because I was in a rush, but because stopping felt like hesitation and hesitation felt like losing control. By the time I reached the ground floor, my grip on the envelope had tightened enough to crease the edges, the paper inside shifting slightly with each step like a reminder that this was real, that this was happening whether I liked it or not. I pushed out onto the street, and the night air hit me again, sharper now, clearer, grounding in a way the apartment had not been. The street looked the same as before, quiet, ordinary, nothing out of place, and for a second I wondered if I had overreacted, if I had let one strange encounter turn into something bigger in my head than it actually was. But then I remembered the envelope, the number, the way it had appeared in my kitchen without a sound, and the doubt disappeared just as quickly as it came. I turned toward the main road, my steps steady now, focused, because if he had found me once, then finding him again should not be impossible, at least that is what I told myself. The pharmacy was still a few blocks away, its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, a small, constant light in a night that felt heavier than usual, and I headed toward it without slowing down. If this started there, then maybe it could end there too. As I walked, I replayed everything in my head, his voice, the way he said my name, the way he looked at me like I was something he had already decided about before I even spoke, and the more I thought about it, the more one thing became clear. This was not random, not curiosity, not coincidence. This was intention. I reached the corner and paused for a second, scanning the street, half expecting to see that same black car waiting somewhere just out of sight. But there was nothing, just a couple of parked cars and a street light humming quietly overhead. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself forward again, because turning back now would mean accepting something I was not ready to accept. When I stepped up to the pharmacy door, I could see the lights were still on, the same flicker, the same sterile brightness spilling onto the sidewalk, and for a moment it felt like I had stepped back in time, like the last hour had folded in on itself. I pushed the door open and walked inside, the bell above it chiming softly, and the man behind the counter looked up. Immediately, recognition flashing across his face. You again, he said, not unkindly, just surprised, and I nodded, moving straight to the counter without hesitation. The cameras, I said, my voice steady, more certain than I felt. I need to see them. And his expression shifted instantly, confusion giving way to something more cautious. We cannot just show security footage, he replied, shaking his head slightly. And I placed the envelope on the counter between us, not opening it, not explaining it, just letting it sit there like a question he could not ignore. Someone used them tonight, I said, holding his gaze, and I need to know how. And for a second the room went quiet again, not the same kind of quiet as before, but close enough that I felt it in my chest. He glanced at the envelope, then back at me, and I could see the hesitation, the calculation, the moment where he was deciding how much he wanted to be involved in something he did not understand. I did not push, did not raise my voice. I just waited, because sometimes silence did more than words ever could. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back slightly, his shoulders dropping just enough to signal a shift. There was a man, he said slowly, carefully, like each word mattered, after you left. And my pulse picked up instantly, not fast, not panicked, just aware. What man? I asked, and he shook his head once, almost to himself. The kind you do not ask questions about, he replied, and something in that answer settled deeper than anything else had tonight, because it confirmed what I already knew but had not wanted to say out loud. I slid the envelope a little closer to him, my fingers releasing it one by one, and met his eyes again, steady, unflinching. I am asking anyway, I said quietly, because if this was going to be my problem now, then I was not going to stand on the outside of it looking in. The way he said it stayed with me, not the words themselves but the weight behind them, like he was warning me without wanting to be the one responsible for what happened next. And for a second I considered stepping back, letting it go, telling myself that not knowing was safer than knowing too much. But then I looked at the envelope between us, at the clean edges, the deliberate presence of it, and I knew that line had already been crossed, whether I chose it or not. Start from the beginning, I said, quieter now, not demanding, just steady, because if I pushed too hard he would shut down, and I needed him to keep talking. He hesitated again, glancing toward the back room like someone might be listening. Even though we were alone, the soft hum of the refrigerator units filling the silence. He came in maybe 10 minutes after you left. He began slowly, his voice lower now, controlled. Did not say much at first, just stood there, looking around like he owned the place. And something in that description lined up too easily with what I had already seen. The calm, the control, the absence of urgency. Did he ask for the footage? I asked, and he shook his head immediately. No, that is the strange part. He did not ask, he just told me to pull up the cameras, he replied. And I felt a small, sharp shift in my chest at that, because there was a difference between asking and telling. And I already knew which one fit him better. And you just did it. I pressed, not accusing, just needing to understand the sequence, the decisions, the points where this could have been stopped. He met my eyes for a second, then looked away, exhaling slowly. You would have too, he said quietly, and there was no defensiveness in it, just truth. And I could not argue with that because I had felt it too, that unspoken pressure that did not need to be explained. I let that sit for a moment, then nodded slightly, accepting it without agreeing. What did he look at? I asked, bringing it back to facts, to something I could follow. You, he said simply, and the word landed heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just a direction on a screen. He had me rewind to when you paid, watched it twice, maybe 3 times, he continued, his voice steady now that he had started, like the story had its own momentum. I felt my fingers curl slightly against the counter, not from fear, just from the awareness of being seen in a way I had not chosen. Did he say anything? I asked, and he shook his head again. Not much, just one thing, he replied, and I leaned in slightly without meaning to, my focus narrowing. He said, make sure she does not come back here for anything she cannot afford. The pharmacist finished, and for a second the words did not make sense, not in the way I expected them to. I frowned slightly, processing it, turning it over in my mind. Because that was not a threat, not a demand. It was something else, something closer to a decision made on my behalf. That is it, I asked, and he nodded. That is it. Then he left, just like that, he said, spreading his hand slightly like he was still trying to understand it himself. I straightened slowly, my thoughts shifting again, recalibrating, because this was not just about the envelope anymore, not just about the money. This was about control, about someone deciding what I needed without asking me. I reached for the envelope and picked it up again, the paper. Inside shifting softly, and this time it felt different in my hand, not heavier, but clearer, like I understood its purpose a little more. Did he give a name? I asked, even though I already suspected the answer, and the pharmacist hesitated for half a second before shaking his head. No, but you do not need one, he said quietly, and I looked at him. Really looked this time, noticing the way his shoulders were still slightly tense, the way his voice stayed low even though there was no one else around. Why? I asked, and he held my gaze just long enough to make sure I was listening. Because people like that do not leave names, he said. They leave impact. And the words settled between us in a way that made everything else feel smaller, simpler, undeniable. I nodded once, slow, deliberate, and turned toward the door without another word, because I had what I came for, even if it was not what I expected. And as I stepped back out into the night, one thought stayed steady, clear, impossible to ignore. He had not just noticed me. He had already started changing things around me. And the real question was not why. It was how far he was willing to go before I stopped him. I stepped out onto the sidewalk again, and the door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like it marked a point I could not step back across. And for a second, I just stood there, letting the night settle around me, letting the information settle into something solid enough to act on. People like that do not leave names. They leave impact. His words replayed in my mind, steady, unavoidable. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that everything he had done so far fit that pattern perfectly. The pharmacy, the envelope, the quiet way he had shifted things without asking. I exhaled slowly and started walking again, but this time not toward home, not toward anything familiar, just forward, because standing still felt like giving him more control than I was willing to allow. The streetlights stretched out in front of me in uneven intervals, casting long shadows that moved with each step I took, and I focused on that, on the rhythm, on the simple fact that I was still choosing where to go next. But even as I walked, I could feel it, that same subtle awareness that I was not entirely alone in this anymore, not in the way I used to be. I stopped at the corner and glanced around, not nervously, just deliberately, scanning the parked cars, the empty storefronts, the quiet intersections, and for a moment everything looked normal, too normal, like a stage set after the actors had already taken their positions. I tightened my grip on the envelope in my hand, the edges pressing into my palm, grounding me in something real, something I could still control. If you are watching, I said under my breath, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, not even sure why I said it out loud at all, then you should know this is not how this works. And the words felt strange in the open air, like I was speaking to something I could not see but knew was there. I shook my head slightly and kept moving, because standing there talking to the night was not going to change anything. And if he really was watching, then he already knew that. I reached the next block and slowed down, my thoughts shifting again, not scattered now but focused, because the more I looked at this, the clearer it became. This was not random kindness. This was intervention, controlled, calculated, and that meant there was a system behind it, a structure, a way to reach him even if he did not leave a name. People like him did not move alone. They left traces in other people, in places, in patterns. I turned toward a small diner on the corner, one that stayed open late, not because I was hungry, but because it was one of the few places where people talked, where information moved quietly between conversations and coffee refills. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warmth hitting me immediately, the low hum of voices and clinking dishes filling the space in a way that felt almost normal, almost safe. I slid into a booth near the back, setting the envelope on the table in front of me, and for a moment I just looked at it again, not with confusion this time, but with intent. If he had chosen to involve himself in my life, then he had also created a path back to him, whether he realized it or not. The waitress approached, offering a small, tired smile, and I returned it automatically, ordering a coffee I did not really want, just to give myself time to think. As she walked away, I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift across the room, noticing details, faces, movements, the subtle ways people interacted when they thought no one was paying attention. This was not his world, not exactly, but it was close enough to the edges that something might slip through, something I could follow. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup when it arrived, the heat seeping into my fingers, steadying, grounding, and I realized something then. Something simple but important. I was not trying to escape this anymore. I was trying to understand it. And understanding meant stepping forward, even if I did not know exactly where the path would lead. I glanced down at the envelope one more time, then back up, my focus sharper now, clearer than it had been all night. Because if he thought he could shape my world from the shadows, then he was about to learn that I was not someone who stayed in the dark for long. I sat there longer than I planned to, the coffee cooling in my hands while my thoughts moved in quiet, deliberate circles, not scattered anymore, not reactive, just focused in a way that felt new. Like something inside me had shifted into place without asking permission. The diner hummed around me, forks against plates, low conversations, the steady rhythm of a world that did not know anything had changed. And for the first time that night, I realized how easily something significant could exist inside something ordinary without anyone noticing. I glanced at the envelope again, then pushed it slightly to the side, not hiding it, just moving it out of the center, because it was no longer the only thing that mattered. What mattered now was what came next. The waitress passed by again, refilling my cup without asking, and I gave her a small nod, watching the way she moved, the way people interacted with her, casual, familiar, like she belonged here in a way I had always tried to belong anywhere. "You look like you are thinking too hard," she said lightly, not stopping, just enough to acknowledge me, and I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Maybe I am," I replied, and she smiled before moving on, leaving me with that simple, grounding exchange that reminded me I was still in control of myself, even if everything else felt uncertain. I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift again, not searching this time, just observing, letting patterns form naturally instead of forcing them. And that was when I noticed it. A man near the counter, not looking at me directly, but not looking either. The kind of awareness that existed without obvious attention. He was dressed simply, nothing like the man from earlier, but there was something in the way he sat, the way he watched the room without moving much, that felt familiar. I held my focus there just long enough to confirm it was not coincidence, then looked away, pretending I had not noticed, because if this was part of whatever system he operated in, then reacting too quickly would only close the door I was trying to open. I took another slow sip of coffee, giving myself a moment to think, to decide, because this was the point where I either stepped forward or walked away, and walking away was no longer an option. I stood up calmly, picking up the envelope and sliding it into my jacket pocket, leaving enough cash on the table to cover the drink, then walked toward the counter as if I was just another customer finishing a late-night stop. As I passed the man, I did not look at him directly, but I spoke just loud enough for him to hear, my voice steady, controlled. "If you are waiting for instructions, you can stop." And I felt it immediately, that slight shift beside me, the smallest pause in his movement, the confirmation I needed without ever having to see his face. I stopped at the counter, pretending to check my phone, giving him time to respond if he chose to. And for a second nothing happened, just the quiet continuation of the diner's rhythm. Then, low and measured, just behind me, a voice I did not recognize said, "You should go home." And I let out a slow breath, not turning, not reacting outwardly, because that was not what this moment required. "I will," I replied, equally calm, "after I return something that does not belong to me." And this time the silence stretched a little longer, heavier, like I had stepped further into something that did not usually allow conversation. I finally turned then, just enough to meet his eyes, and there it was again, not the same man, but the same pattern, the same quiet control behind someone else's presence. "Tell him," I said, holding that gaze without backing down, "that I do not accept gifts I did not ask for." And for a fraction of a second, something shifted there, not surprise, not resistance, just acknowledgement, like a message had been received exactly as intended. He gave a slight nod, barely noticeable, and that was enough. I turned back toward the door and walked out into the night again. But this time it felt different, Not like I was being followed, not like I was reacting, but like I had finally taken a step into the same space he had been standing in all along. The air felt colder, sharper, more real, and as I started back toward my apartment, one thought settled clearly in my mind. Steady and unshaken, he had reached into my world without asking. But now I had reached back, and whatever happened next, it would not be on his terms alone.